In the late 1950s, with the Cold War in full swing, the U.S. Navy found itself in need of an aircraft carrier-based fighter that could defend the battle group from Russian bombers. And because the Russian bombers had a new collection of very capable air-to-surface strike weapons, this airplane had to be able to fly long ranges at high speeds. As sort of fallout from the previous programs, the Navy started this effort with three components: the AIM-54 Phoenix missile, the AWG-9 radar, and the TF-30 engine built by Pratt & Whitney. The Navy was further directed by the Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, a former auto industry exec who prioritized attempts to streamline the DoD procurement process, to partner with the Air Force in the development of the new fighter. All the two services could agree on with what was labeled the TFX program was that it needed two engines, two crew members, and swing wing technology. The result was the F-111B, an airplane that was designed to meet the Air Force mission requirements first and carrier suitability a distant second. Consequently, when the Navy took the F-111 to the boat for the first time, they were less than impressed. In fact, after getting reports from test pilots about their concerns, Vice Admiral Tom Connolly, the Navy's Director of Air Warfare at the time, flew the airplane himself and then testified before Congress against the U.S. Navy's official position that the F-111 was unsuitable for use as part of a carrier air wing. So Congress canceled the Navy part of the TFX program, which freed the Navy up to pursue their own option without being forced to work with the Air Force. The Navy put out a request for proposals for what they called the TFX program, and 5 defense companies responded. Grumman's entry was called the Tomcat, in tribute to Vice Admiral Connolly, who put his career on the line to kill the Navy version of the F-111B, and in keeping with their tradition of naming fighters after cats like Wildcat, Hellcat, and Bearcat. Grumman won the competition and received the contract award in January of 1969. Grumman's Tomcat incorporated the same 3 elements that were passed down from the start of the Navy's effort for a fleet air defense platform: the Phoenix missile, the AWG-9 radar, and the Pratt & Whitney TF-30 engine. Although it was lighter than the F-111, those components made the Tomcat the biggest and heaviest fighter ever to fly from an American aircraft carrier at a base weight of around 42,000 pounds. And that's why it became known as the Big Fighter. To minimize the risk of having the program canceled by the new Nixon administration, the Navy skipped the prototype phase and jumped right into full-scale development, which is what the Air Force also did with the F-15 Eagle program, by the way. The first F-14 flew just 22 months after Grumman was awarded the contract. The second flight resulted in the airplane crashing on short final while approaching the company's runway at Bethpage, Long Island, due to a total hydraulic failure. Fortunately, both pilot and Rio ejected successfully, which provided an unintended test point for the program. But despite this setback, the Tomcat's development continued in earnest, including full carrier suitability testing and a test flight where the airplane shot 6 Phoenix missiles at 6 different drone targets. Note that 4 hit, 1 missed, and 1 was declared no test because the drone's radar augmentation, which was designed to give the target the signature of a MiG-21, failed. The F-14 began fleet operations in 1973. In addition to the training squadron, VF-124, commonly known as the RAG, which is an acronym for Replacement Air Group, the first 2 seagoing squadrons were the VF-1 Wolfpack and the VF-2 Bounty Hunters aboard the USS Enterprise CVN-65. The first real-world missions were flying combat air patrol off the coast of South Vietnam during the evacuation. By 1983, the U.S. Navy had 22 F-14 squadrons, which gave all but the Japan-based carrier air wing 2 Tomcat squadrons each. That meant American aircraft carriers each had 24 high-speed, long-range, long-endurance fighters capable of carrying combinations of 3 types of missiles: the long-range semi-active Phoenix, the medium-range radar-guided Sparrow, and the short-range heat-seeking Sidewinder, and a 20mm nose cannon. Tomcat crews fully leveraged the airplane's capabilities, and in the process, they rewrote the expeditionary warfare playbook for mission areas like combat air patrol, fighter sweep, and strike escort. Additionally, the TARPS pod, TARPS is an acronym for Tactical Air Reconnaissance Pod System, gave the battle group and often the National Command Authority photographic intelligence that in some scenarios, like the conflict in Bosnia in 1995, was the F-14's principal utility. Through the 1980s, the pacing threat was consistent. It remained the Soviet Union with a large, capable Air Force and an over-the-horizon Navy. For sailors based on the east coast of the United States, That meant deployments to the Mediterranean and occasionally North Atlantic to keep American resolve top of mind with the Russians. And the way that was often done was by launching a couple of Alert 5 Tomcats off the carrier to intercept and escort Soviet aircraft until they no longer posed a threat to the battle group or NATO allies. The visual of seeing an F-14 off their wing loaded with 3 types of missiles no doubt wasn't lost on Soviet aircrews. During those years, the U.S. Navy also conducted what they called freedom of navigation operations off the coast of Libya, sailing in waters that dictator Muammar Gaddafi claimed as sovereign in spite of the fact that they weren't. On 2 occasions, in 1981 and 1989, the Libyan Air Force sent fighters out to test the Tomcats on cap stations, and both times the Libyan pilots wound up getting shot down. The final box score, U.S. Navy Tomcats 4, Libyan Air Force 0. The Tomcat was an incredibly capable airplane with a notable deficiency that too frequently reared its head during aggressive maneuvering and while launching from and landing on the aircraft carrier. The TF-30 engine, which wasn't originally built for the F-14 but rather forced into it, tended to compressor stall at high angles of attack. And when this happened during a dogfight, if the resultant asymmetric thrust was too great and or the pilot was slow to react, the Tomcat might enter an irrecoverable flat spin. And in one case, in 1994, a compressor stall was a contributing factor to a high visibility mishap involving one of the first female Tomcat pilots assigned to the VF-213 Black Lions aboard USS Lincoln. At one time, there was a plan to fix that problem as well as update the airplane altogether. In the mid-80s, the Navy intended for all Tomcat squadrons to upgrade to the F-14D by the 87-88 timeframe. The D had the much more powerful and reliable General Electric F-110 engine, the APG-71, a digital radar system instead of the analog AUG-9, the NACES ejection seat, one of the first without an upper handle, and infrared search and track, along with other improvements. But in 1989, then Secretary of Defense, later Vice President Dick Cheney, refused to purchase enough F-14Ds to replace the existing fleet, and after some wrangling and budgetary horse trading in Congress, the Navy had to settle for 55 Ds and 86 F-14A pluses, later redesignated the F-14B, which retained the AUG-9 radar, but had the GE F-110 engine along with improved radar warning gear. The other 626 Tomcats in the fleet remained the A model. In 1991, Desert Storm highlighted both the capabilities and the limitations of the Tomcat. The 6 aircraft carriers stationed across the Red Sea and North Arabian Sea meant long transits for the air wings to get to their targets and cap stations in Iraq, and that's where the F-14's endurance was an advantage. But the airplane's lack of a state-of-the-art onboard identification of friend or foe system kept the Joint Task Force planners from assigning the Tomcat to forward-edge fighter sweep missions, and they were relegated to secondary and tertiary defense positions. Community highlights from Desert Storm, as discussed in depth in other episodes on the channel, were a VF-103 F-14B shot down by a SAM over western Iraq, where the crew ejected and the pilot was picked up by the Combat Search and Rescue helicopter, and the Rio became a POW for the balance of the war, and a VF-1 F-14A shooting down an Iraqi helicopter with a Sidewinder. The years following Desert Storm saw a massive change in carrier aviation as the Russian threat continued to fade. As naval aviation accounts were reduced under the auspices of a peace dividend, leadership had some decisions to make. The A-6 Intruder bomber was retired, and the Tomcat's untapped but always resident bombing capability was unlocked. Suddenly, F-14 crews who were by and large ignorant of the attack side of things found themselves with upwards of 6 Mark 80 series weapons on their airplanes. Training matrices were modified to include less dogfighting and more bomb dropping. But the Tomcat's 10 mil accuracy compared to the legacy Hornet's 1 mil accuracy made it the choice of last resort, especially in scenarios where missing the target would cause international condemnation. But the Bombcat, as the airplane was informally labeled, nonetheless became a force multiplier. Then in the second half of the 1990s, the F-14's operational performance was upgraded again, this time with a capability that would make it the preeminent strike warfare platform for the balance of its service life. The Lantern Pod, which stands for Low Altitude Navigation and Targeting Infrared for Night, was modded to work on the Tomcat, and among the improvements was a new 10x10 digital display that replaced the old tactical information display in the Rio's cockpit. 2 guys in the airplane was an advantage. The pilot would pickle the bomb and the Rio would guide it to the target. Now, in addition to Mark 80 series dumb bombs, the F-14 could deliver guided bombs, including the GBU-10, which was the 2,000-pounder. Suddenly, the Tomcat was the airplane of choice when the mission required a high level of precision during weapons delivery. And this capability came just in time as it was used during Operation Southern Watch, which was the patrolling of the no-fly zone over southern Iraq, Operation Allied Force in Kosovo, and both post-9/11 conflicts, Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan and Operation Iraqi Freedom in Iraq. At about the same time, the F-14 incorporated DFCS, the Digital Flight Control System, that made it safer to fly at high angles of attack, in essence eliminating the threat of flat spins and when trying to land aboard the carrier. By the early 2000s, the Pentagon made the call that, absent a peer threat like the Soviet Union, variables like speed and range were subordinate to variables like cost to operate and fix airplanes, and the decision was made to retire the Tomcat and replace it with an upgraded version of the Hornet called the Super Hornet, which wasn't as fast and couldn't fly as far as the Tomcat, but was easier and cheaper to maintain and fly. In the endgame, Grumman offered ideas to keep the F-14 alive, but they mostly fell on deaf ears in the Pentagon, and the Tomcat was officially removed from U.S. Naval Aviation's inventory in the fall of 2006. Now, as documented in another episode of the channel, the only other nation to fly the Tomcat was Iran, and they have used the airplane to good effect, and they got a lot of kills using the Phoenix missile during the Iran-Iraq war. And the F-14 is still active in their Air Force, which in and of itself is impressive. The first thing that made the Tomcat great is how it stayed relevant to a moving requirements picture and threat throughout more than 32 years of fleet operations. Over its life, the F-14 went from a groundbreaking analog interceptor to a best-in-class digital strike fighter. Innovation was always the airplane's hallmark, whether it was upgrading the missile suite and associated displays as the enemy's capabilities improved, or going from wet film to real-time transmission of digital imagery with the TARPS pod, or assuming the Forward Air Controller airborne mission, which allowed Tomcat crews to save the day for coalition troops on the ground countless times during the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. Basically, if the nation needed it from a carrier-based asset, the Tomcat had the inherent flexibility to accomplish it. The second thing that made the Tomcat great is its mystique, how it captured the public's heart and forged itself into the cultural landscape. A lot of that can be attributed to Hollywood, of course. For the last 40 years, when screenwriters and directors needed a fighter that would delight moviegoers by its mere presence, not to mention its on-screen performance, they turned to the F-14. Even parked on the flight line, the F-14's size and muscular lines exuded dominance and power. Nothing else ever has or will wow airshow crowds like that airplane did in its heyday. And the third and most important thing that made the Tomcat great is the people who operated it. I was lucky enough to be assigned to 4 different F-14 squadrons during my career, logging more than 2,500 flight hours in the process. I shared ready rooms with the most supremely talented aviators on the planet. But without equally talented maintenance teams, we aviators are just guys sitting in our flight gear twiddling our thumbs. From the maintenance master chiefs, franchise players all, to the work center supervisors, to the final checkers and plane captains on the flight decks during launches and recoveries, the enlisted personnel I served with were incredibly dedicated and hardworking and technically savvy. My level of systems understanding compared to theirs was like being able to tell time versus knowing how to build a watch. Over my 16 years of flying the airplane, they taught me a lot that made me a better Rio, especially when things weren't working right. They also moved earth and sky to make every scheduled sortie, and in the process, they led me more than I ever led them. All right, that'll do it for this episode. More additions coming to the What Makes This Plane Great series soon, so stay tuned for your favorites. And if you're not already a subscriber, hit the button so you don't miss anything. And if you'd like to help support the channel, please consider using the super thanks, the heart icon below, or become a patron at patreon.com/wardcarroll. And in the meantime, I look forward to talking to you again very soon.